You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
So this is the lone pine, the old lone pine that stands in the grounds of the Australian War Memorial. And just across the driveway from us, we've got the new lone pine, which has been propagated after this old one got struck by lightning.
Malia Hampton is an historian at the memorial. We're meeting on a cool autumn morning to view these living exhibits, these trees laden with history.
This is a tree that comes from a tree that was really well known on the battlefield of Gallipoli. On the heights above the beach, there was a lone pine, a pine on its own. And the soldiers all at the time were into this American song called Lonesome Pine. And so they had a laugh and called it the Lonesome Pine, relating it to that old song, which has been shortened since then till Lone Pine.
On a mountain in Virginia stands a lonesome pine. Just below is the cabin home of a little girl of mine.
In August 1915, that was the site of a really vicious battle and the tree was destroyed. But that tree is specifically the one that this tree comes from.
We'll talk about that battle a little later, but first, how did, well, I suppose a replica, if you like, of the lone pine come to be here at the War Memorial?
The story of this tree is all bound up in that battle, and it's to do with the story of a man who was known as Mark Alexander Dryce, but he was born Mark Alexander Smith. He was killed in action at Lone Pine. I feel really sad for that little kid. He had a really hard life. His dad ran off and he spent some time in a reformatory home and things, and when war broke out, he enlisted as a means of earning money and perhaps for the stability it gave. He was killed in action. Well, he went missing in August 1915 at Lone Pine, and his brother, who was Benjamin Smith, who was serving in a different battalion, went looking for his brother's body to see if he could afford him a proper burial, and he couldn't find him. But what he did pick up was some pine cones from the Lonesome Pine to send home to his mum in memory of this brother who was gone and almost certainly killed in action.
Mark and Benjamin's mother, Jane McMillan, took the seeds from one of the pine cones and raised two seedlings. One was planted in a park in the New South Wales town of Inverell, where her sons had enlisted. The other was presented to the War Memorial, which was then under construction. Only the foundations had been built. It was planted in 1934 by the Duke of Gloucester in what was then just a bare paddock. Now it's part of the memorial's well-cared-for grounds. There's a busy road nearby, and the tree's base is roped off to help protect it.
It has had a little bit of a hard life. I started working here in 2013, and not very long afterwards it was struck by lightning, and so it's lost large parts of itself. Big limbs have come off, but it's still going and is doing very well. And there's stories of it having been washed away during a really rough storm as well, one of those really flooding Canberra storms. So
almost washed away.
Almost washed away, yes, not quite. But I mean, it's such an important part of our grounds here that we take extra good care of it, and I'm sure we've got all the arborists on it if there's ever a problem.
And I'm not very good at judging the height of trees, but it is many metres tall. It towers over the other trees, including some eucalypts that are planted around here.
Yeah, it's really tall. I'm not sure how tall it would be, but it's a staggering tree, and it's the tallest along the road, I think.
And you mentioned the new lone pine. Now, it's actually in a protective cage on the other side of this little road that leads up to the memorial. What's the story of it?
Well, it was planted possibly in response to the lightning strike, I think, just because our big old one is just, it's getting old, and so we wanted to put another one on the grounds just for the day when we don't have the big one. It was planted by Prince William and his wife Catherine when they were out to visit us for Anzac Day, and I was only talking to my husband the other day. It's grown so much in the few years it's been in. I think it's nearly outgrown its cage, so it's doing very well.
So obviously the cage was just to protect it in its early years and will eventually be taken off.
It will, yes. It was only tiny when they put it in. It was only like a couple of feet high, and now it's got a nice, really strong trunk, and it's touching right at the top of the cage. So It's a grown-up tree.
After a few more minutes outside, admiring both trees and dodging the lawnmowers, Malia suggests we go inside to see the memorial's lone pine diorama. But she gives me a heads up. The diorama doesn't actually feature the famous pine tree.
Yeah, strangely enough, the one thing you won't see in the lone pine diorama is the lone pine itself. It got destroyed by shell fire. I don't know how long it lasted on the battlefield, so I don't know whether it was blown up in August during the battle or slightly before, or whether it just became an apocryphal story that they told each other when it was gone, or whether most of them would have seen it. But whatever it was, it's something that rings out as a major part of the experience of Gallipoli, whether it's a rumour or a vision, like actual visual sighting of the tree, it's always there.
Okay, let's go have a look at this diorama.
Great. So Louise, if you come this way, we're coming into the First World War galleries, and this here is our lone pine diorama. It is one of our most loved dioramas. It's incredibly involved, and we have so many visitors come to see it.
For people who haven't seen one of the amazing war memorial dioramas, can you describe it for us, Malia? I mean, first of all, it's huge.
It is really big. I guess it's 4 or 5 metres across, and it goes back quite a distance, and it's been put together to give you a sense of perspective as well. So at the front we can see into the Turkish trench system, so that you can look down into the trenches where there are men with rifles and bullets and bodies and things. On top we've got the men trying to force their way into the trenches through the pine logs, and then the figures disappear off into the distance of the men running up the hill and attacking, and you can sort of see then across onto the painted background across the sea into the islands of Imbros and Samothraki, I think they are.
And that backdrop is painted so beautifully. Right at the back you can see the sun, but it's all hazy through the smoke, and you can see out to sea smoke rising from some of the ships out in the water, and a ship on the horizon.
Yeah, the whole point of the dioramas is to give you a sense of being there. They were specifically commissioned for the memorial, like as part of our art collection, but the idea was that the depth and just being able to overlook it and look back and into it would give you more of a sense of being there and a sense of atmosphere in a way a painting or a sculpture couldn't do on its own.
And that sense of perspective is achieved too by the size of the figures. So the figures of the soldiers, the Turkish soldiers in the trenches and the Australian soldiers above, at the front they're quite high, but as you look at the figures in the background, they're smaller and smaller.
Yeah, they've forced the perspective a little bit to try and really give you depth and a concept of distance and you know, the event as it happened. So that, yeah, it's a little bit more than you would see normally, but the idea is to give you the idea that you are there and looking from a sort of removed perspective.
And so much action in the figures. What are the figures made of?
They're made of lead, so they're lead alloy possibly, but they're metal, and then they've been painted over the top. And all of our figures in all of our dioramas are the same sort of thing. This one was specifically commissioned in 1924 and then completed in 1927. And my understanding is that some of the men who worked on this were veterans of the war itself.
And the different poses the figures are striking. Some are running, carrying their weapons. Some are obviously firing. This soldier here with his left arm flung into the air maybe has just been shot. I'm not sure.
I think he probably has. I think that's what that's trying to depict. This has all been done in consultation with men who were there. The process of collating the art collection and as part of that the dioramas has always been about accuracy. So it's put together by the founder of the memorial, Charles Bean, and John Trelaw and others, and what they want this to do is be as accurate as they can possibly get it. So they talk to people, they ask for opinions, they ask for opinions before and after, should we change it, they will go back and modify various things. As long as this looks and feels as much as they can get it to the actual event, that's what they were going for.
So tell us about the actual event that this is depicting. It is called the Lone Pine diorama.
Yeah, so it's part of the August offensive on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Gallipoli we think about as a lot to do with landing and establishing this perimeter and this Anzac's, small patch of land on this peninsula in Turkey. After that happened and it all settled down and, after a few weeks of fierce fighting, there was nothing happening. They couldn't get out. Either they had to come away or they needed to do something. And so in August, they launched a series of offensives to do something, to try and force this perimeter open, gain the heights and get access to the Dardanelles Straits beyond. As part of that, most of this action in the Anzac perimeter is happening up to the north. They're trying to capture Hill 971 and Chunuk Bair, the real heights. But the Australians conduct a couple of feints to try and wrong foot the Turks and keep the reserves away from the main action, and Lone Pine is one of those. So on the 6th of August 1915, just as the sun was setting, as we can see in the diorama, the Australians attack up a hill towards a Turkish position is known as Lone Pine. As they come across no man's land, they discover, to their horror, that many of the trenches are roofed over with pine logs. The diorama we have here today has some of those pine logs from the battlefield in front of the diorama that you can see.
They're actually from the battlefield.
They've been brought back from Turkey, and those are some of the logs that had to be ripped up and pulled aside so that the men could get into the trenches. Once they're in the trenches, it's just a scene of horrific and just vicious fighting. What is among the last times, because the battle is so technical and artillery driven that they don't really come to grips with the enemy in this sort of way ever again. It is clubs and bayonets and knives and revolvers and really, really vicious personal fighting in under covered up trenches, which you can see here, and it goes on for 4 days.
4 days?
Yeah, it goes for a really long time. And in the end, they prevail and they capture Lone Pine, where all of the rest of the August offensive fails everywhere else.
At what cost, though? What were the casualties?
There were 2,000 Australian casualties at Lone Pine. There was also an unprecedented number of Victoria Crosses because it's just such an intense period of time. So there's a lot of dead men, a lot of gallantry and action, and that's part of what they're trying to capture in this, is this desperate action, which is so costly.
And do we know the toll on the Turkish soldiers? How many of those died at Lone Pine?
We don't know. There are estimates, and they always far exceed what the Allied estimates are, so we're never really sure, and people are still working in Turkish archives to work it out.
So back to the actual diorama, you say it was completed in 1927. Has it always been on display like this at the memorial?
It has always been on display at the memorial, but it's been in different places. So these things are very hard to move, but they are movable. I believe it got cut in half to move it around. It was in our Gallipoli galleries for many, many years before that. And before that in different galleries again. But our dioramas, all of our First World War dioramas are heritage listed, and we would never not display them.
And a really practical question, how do you keep it clean? Because, obviously it's depicting a muddy battle, but the beautiful figurines themselves made of metal, they must get extremely dusty. I know you keep the War Memorial very clean, but still, dust gets in.
We do, and they do get dusty, and we get up there in our socks and we clean it off. So we do gallery maintenance on a regular basis, and part of that is crawling up onto the dioramas and very carefully cleaning around them. But it takes a lot of care, but they're very solid things. There are lots of wooden struts underneath. The mud is all plaster and all sorts of things, and so you can actually climb on them, but please don't.
But when you do, you're not too worried about breaking anything?
No. A lot of care needs to be taken that some of the movable parts go back to exactly where they were, and you don't accidentally bend some barbed wire to the wrong position or move rifles or something like that. But for the most part, it's all solid and immovable, and you can clean it fairly gently but easily.
I know that the dioramas at the War Memorial are amongst the most loved exhibits, and as you say, they've always been here, though in different places. What do you think, as someone who's studied this battle in particular, what do you think when you view this diorama?
I might be a bit different, but when I look at this sort of thing, I always think about the men who came and looked at it and remembered what the action was, because the memorial was put in place for people for who the war was an immediate thing. So mothers whose sons were killed here, and men who were here and lost mates, or those sorts of things. And like the eyes that have seen this have seen the actual events as well and left satisfied. And so I can't help but think of the people it was made for, the people who survived the war and needed it to be remembered.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. On a rainy morning, I visit the government nursery at Yarralumla. This is where seeds from the memorial's lone pine are propagated and sold to the public for commemorative purposes. The proper name for the tree is the Aleppo pine, or Pinus halepensis.
So this is one of our greenhouses at the government Yarralumla nursery that we grow the Pinus halepensis at.
Tinus Eilish is the nursery's marketing manager.
This is our latest or newest lone pine seedlings that will be ready for sale now for Anzac Day. And throughout the year we've got also available. So at the moment we've got 900 tubes available, about 250 140 mils, and 90 200 ml pots that will be ready for this Anzac Day sale.
The seedlings come in 4 different sizes, starting from the 15 to 20 centimetre high ones we're looking at here in small tubes. So how are the pine cones gathered from the lone pine at the memorial?
It's quite a process, yes. It starts off by sending a contractor out in October, November to cage each individual cone on the tree.
Well, hold on a tick. You mean put a little cage around each cone?
Each cone, yes. But yes, it's as many cones as we can and as reachable as you can, because the tree is 20 metres tall.
What do these little cages look like?
It's basically a stainless steel mesh wire cage almost that will go over the cone and the branch. So without hurting the branch, it protects the cone and the branch the cone is on.
So what you're trying to protect the cone from is the cockatoos?
Yes, they are our main little thieves of the cone that we're trying to protect them from. We still leave a few for them, but the major ones and more mature ones we cage for ourselves.
So you protect each cone that you think is going to be useful. For how long does that cage stay on? When do you actually gather the cones?
So basically after October we send out our contractor again, and then from March to July, depending on the elements like how warm our summers was, and then from there on in we'll just collect them between March and July.
Roughly how many cones would you collect each year? I know that depends on a lot of different variables, but do you have a figure?
I can't say the figure because, like I said, every year it differs depending on the elements, but it's about 500 to 1,000 seedlings we get out of a batch.
Right, okay, and so you get different numbers of seeds out of each cone as well?
Yeah, average per cone it's 100 seeds, but not all of them are unfortunately viable. But yeah, that's the percentage we usually go on each year to propagate.
The nursery posts around 80 seedling tubes a month to schools, RSL clubs, church and community groups and private individuals around Australia. It's also sent specimens overseas.
So in 2015, we sent out 20 seeds to Australian Embassy in Washington, D.C.
So just the seeds for
Just
that
the seeds.
purpose?
Yes, just the seeds. Posting is a bit difficult towards there. So they propagated them themselves. They just asked for the seeds. Also in 2015, 2 trees was presented by Prime Minister Tony Abbott to the Prime Minister of Republic of Turkey, and they were planted in Ankara. And then in 2016, 4 trees were sent to Japan to commemorate their 70th anniversary of their lives lost at the Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II.
Tinus has some good advice for anyone who wants to grow a lone pine. First, make sure you have plenty of space.
It's classified as a medium tree, but it can become a big tree as well if it's in a good environment. So it can grow up to 20 metres like the War Memorial one here in Canberra, and it's 15 metres in width, and its trunk is about a metre in width as well. So it starts off by being light grey with a smooth trunk, and then turn reddish brown with furrows and scaly ridges when mature.
What do the people who work here at the government nursery think about being in charge, if you like, of making sure these lone pines are propagated, that they grow well and that they can be sent out to people who want them?
We strive in excellent, good, mature little tubes to make sure they survive in everyone's gardens. It's really important for us because we know the background and the history importance of these little seedlings. Like 2,000 Australian war soldiers died. So in commemorance of them, we really find it really important for us to keep this history alive.
I'm keen to get a look at the actual lone pine seeds. So Tinnis takes me to where they're stored at the nursery. Extra seeds are kept in fireproof vaults at the CSIRO.
So this is our seed store where we store most of our seeds and Pinus halepensis.
Oh, wow. A room full of shelves and jars and presumably thousands and thousands of seeds.
Yes, we call this the lolly shop because of all the bottles and the seed varieties that's in here. So it's basically marked from A to Z if you go from left to right.
Okay, so where's our seeds?
So that's about in the middle. Like I said, it's from A to Z. So Pinus halepensis is, so basically P. So Pinus halepensis. Pinus halepensis. So that's the last of our little bit there because we've just propagated into our trays. That will be next year's tubes.
So this is a tiny little jar, like a small Vegemite jar, really. And if I hold it up to the light, oh yeah, you can see, I mean, you can't count how many, but just a tiny scattering left on the bottom of the glass.
Yeah, so that's about 96 grams that's left out of this last batch we've propagated from.
It's lovely to see the seeds.
Yeah, they're quite nice, and you can't believe from a little seed like that a big tree comes from.
That's right. I mean, you know, it's like a grain of dust, really.
Yes.
Thank you, Tinnis.
No problem.
Better make sure I put it back on the right shelf.
Yeah, just there's fine.
So Louise, we're just approaching the lone pine that we planted on the junior campus in 2019. And I've also got Maya Stout here, one of the students who helped us plant the tree.
How do you think it's looking?
Oh look, I'm really happy that it seems to be growing a little bit. We've got a really nice little barricade here to keep it safe. The juniors look like they're treating it nicely.
Glenn McKenzie is a humanities and social sciences teacher at Waniasa School in Canberra. Maya is in Year 10. I'm here to witness one example of how the baby lone pines are used in the community. So how did this planting come about?
Actually, the idea came to us from a former student. The parent of one of our students from 2018 works in the nursery and remembered the World War I units that we had been teaching and essentially sent it to the school offering whether we'd want to find somewhere to plant it. So it was actually a parent-led gesture.
To do with what you were teaching at the school?
Absolutely. So we have a unit in Year 9 that focuses on World War I. We focus quite heavily on Gallipoli and the Australian story over there. And we want our students to learn as much as they can about all of the different stories of the soldiers who fought during the First World War. And Gallipoli obviously is, one of those big legendary stories that we have to tell.
So Maya, what was your involvement? Why did you get involved in planting the lone pine?
So back in World War I, my great-great-grandfather was actually a soldier and actually fought in World War I. So when we were doing our World War I assessment piece, we were doing it based on a relative who had fought in it. And because I had a direct relative, Mr. McKenzie had asked me to do a speech at the planting and help plant the lone pine tree, which was an honour, and I'm so happy I was asked to do it, so yeah.
What was the name of your relative and what do you know about his service?
His name was Harold Anthony Stout.
Did he come back from the war?
Yeah, he came back from the war and then ended up enlisting again for World War II, which is sad that he had to do that, but he took time out of his family and his work to do it and fight for our country, which is amazing.
What did you say in your speech?
I had told a bit of my great-grandfather's story, one of the battles that from my research, I had deducted that he would have been a part of. I had given a bit of a background on that and how that probably is the reason why my father is now part of the army, how he probably was inspired from that to join. So that was my speech for the day.
So you really come from a defence family?
Yeah, we've been sadly moved around a lot because of Dad's work, but Dad being in the army has given me and my family so many opportunities, so it's been a blessing.
It's funny, when we run the unit, a lot of students only find out for the first time that they had an ancestor who fought in World War I. I myself had an ancestor who passed away in the Battle of Hamel, and it's always really great because the assignment is actually about following their journey, and so they start to learn more about their family. I'd say a good third of our students actually didn't know that they had ancestors in the war, and so the unit that we run is just a really fantastic opportunity for them to learn a bit more about that.
Maya, did you know before you started the unit about your great-grandfather's service?
No, I had no idea. Once we had been given the assessment task, I went home and asked Dad if we did have anybody in our past that had fought, and he went like, well, actually you do, and gave me some information, and then it was so fun to learn a part of my family's history that, you know, we didn't really talk about. So yeah, it was a shock at first to go like, oh, my family goes back that far, okay, and then he had sacrificed so much to fight for our country, so it was awesome.
What was involved in the little ceremony you had to plant the lone pine?
So we had several students in year 9 and 10 who had been studying the war. We wanted some of them to tell their personal stories. Maya told the story of her ancestor. We also had a former student come by and talk about their experience in the cadets, and it was all about tying our current, I guess, place in history to the legend of the Anzacs, to this Australian story that we all share in the First World War. We also had the principal come down and give a short speech talking about how fortunate we are to have a lone pine planted on the junior campus, and we had quite a few 5 and 6 students come out and witness the planting, and they actually were involved in putting some of the soil in as well.
So it was a pretty special day.
It was a really special day. I think it's the first time we've been able to really celebrate a living piece of history. I mean, when we look at these trees, you know, we think of them as relics of more than 100 years of our past, and it's a really special thing, I think, for the juniors to be able to come up here and see this special tree, and when they move up into year 9 to actually learn where it comes from and the beautiful histories that we have with it.
As you say, Glenn, it's surrounded by a bit of a plastic barricade at the moment and some, you know, like tomato stakes just to protect it while it's little. But, you know, one day it's going to be huge, and it's got all this beautiful space around here to grow and to flourish.
Absolutely, yeah. We have quite a few trees out front of the junior campus, and I think this one adding to it, it's just going to look amazing when it gets tall. And I think the students who continue to come here and see it grow and the photos we take of it, it's going to be a really special thing when it's nice and tall.
Maya, what did it mean to you to actually help put this, what was then a very little tree, into the ground?
It was an honour to be involved in preserving our little small school's memory and knowledge of such an important battle that people sadly lost their lives to. But it was great, and if we had the opportunity again, which we probably won't, I would so do it again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.